The vows were half spoken when the chapel doors didn't just open, they surrendered. The heavy oak groaned against the stone walls, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the sea of white roses and stunned silence. My fiancé's hand went cold in mine, a sudden damp tremor that told me everything I needed to know before I even turned around. Standing at the back of the church was a man who seemed to swallow the light, dressed in a bespoke suit that looked sharp enough to cut the very air he breathed. As he moved down the aisle with a fluid, predatory grace, his gaze remained locked on my tear-filled eyes, ignoring the 300 guests who had begun to whisper like spreading smoke. I looked at David, expecting him to demand an explanation, to protect me, to be the man I thought I was marrying. Instead, his face had gone a sickly shade of gray, his eyes wide and fixed on the stranger with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The man reached the altar, the signature serpent tattoo on his throat pulsing as he spoke in a low, melodic threat. "You have a very expensive taste in brides, David," he said, his voice a physical weight in the small room. "Too bad you paid for her with my money." David's knees buckled. I I can get it back," he stammered, the ring he had been about to place on my finger slipping from his shaking grasp. "Please, Kenji. Just give me time." Kenji didn't look at the ring. He stepped onto the altar, placing a firm, tattooed hand on my shoulder, the dark ink jarring against the delicate white lace of my gown. He looked at the trembling groom with a disdain so cold it felt like a winter wind. "Time is up," Kenji declared, his thumb brushing the silk of my sleeve. "You've lost your collateral. The groom is irrelevant now." The priest stood frozen, his Bible shaking in his hands, as Kenji turned to the congregation with the calm certainty of a king reclaiming his throne. "I will marry her instead," he announced, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. David fell back in a fit of silent, surprised horror, his mouth agape as he watched his life's debt be settled with the woman he claimed to love. As Kenji took my hand, his palm warm and rough with a power that radiated through me, I realized my life as I knew it had ended before I could even say, "I do." The heavy door of the sleek black car closed with a thud that sounded like a coffin lid, sealing me away from the ruins of my wedding day. Beside me, Kenji sat in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure, his silhouette sharp against the passing city lights. I watched the cathedral shrink in the rearview mirror until it vanished, taking with it the memory of David's pale, surprised face. We were moving toward the outskirts of the city, leaving behind the world of white roses for a landscape of steel and shadows. The stronghold was not the dark dungeon I had expected, but a fortress of glass and obsidian perched high above the harbor. As we passed through a series of reinforced gates, men in dark suits bowed with a precision that bordered on the military. Kenji led me through a lobby of cold marble, his hand firm on my elbow, guiding me with a strange mix of possession and protection. We reached a private study where the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and old paper. The door clicked shut behind us, and for the first time, the man who had bought my life turned to face me fully. He shed his suit jacket, tossing it onto a leather chair, and began to unbutton his cuffs. "You look like you're waiting for the executioner, Maya," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that made my skin prickle. He stepped into the light of a desk lamp, and I finally saw it, the tattoo that had been a blurred threat at the altar. Up close, the serpent on his throat was a masterpiece of ink and pain. It wasn't just a snake, it was a dragon serpent, its scales intricately detailed in shades of deep charcoal and iron gray. The tail began beneath his collarbone, winding upward, while the head rested just beneath his jawline, its eyes a piercing, vivid crimson. And the ink seemed to pulse with the movement of his throat as he spoke. "In my world, we do not believe in accidents," Kenji said, noticing my gaze. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of the serpent's head. "This is the Imugi. In the old legends, it is a creature that must survive 1,000 years of hardship and trials before it can become a true dragon. He stepped closer, the scent of his cologne, dark and spicy, enveloping me. It represents a debt that can never be fully paid. It is the weight of every soul I have had to crush to stand where I am. I found my voice, though it was high and thin. Is that what I am to you? Another trial? Another debt to be collected? Kenji's expression softened, though his eyes remained as hard as flint. He reached out, his fingers brushing the lace of my sleeve before resting on my shoulder, mirroring the gesture from the altar. David thought you were a prize to be traded, he said, his voice dropping an octave. But the emoji does not collect scraps, it collects potential. You aren't the debt, Maya. You are the investment. He leaned in, his lips inches from my ear, the heat from his body radiating through my thin gown. You think you've been caged, but I have just given you the only key to survival in this city. You will learn the iron laws of this house, and in return, no one, not David, not the shadows that hunt me, will ever make you bow again. As he walked away to pour a drink, I looked at the dark silhouette of the serpent on his neck. It was a mark of violence, yes, but also of endurance. I realized then that my life hadn't just changed owners. I was being forged into something new. The silk of my wedding dress felt heavier than before, no longer a shroud of betrayal, but the first layer of armor. The morning light in the stronghold was as cold and sharp as a surgeon's blade. I sat at a heavy mahogany table, still dressed in the silk trousers Mrs. Kong had provided. Watching the steam rise from a cup of tea, I was too restless to drink. The silence of the estate was broken only by the muffled footsteps of guards in the hall, a constant reminder that I was now a resident of a world where peace was merely a well-guarded intermission. I was beginning to find a strange sort of rhythm in the quiet until Kenji entered the room, his phone in hand and his jaw set in a line of rigid iron. He didn't say a word. He simply placed the device on the table and pressed play on a recorded call. The voice that crackled through the speaker was one I would have recognized anywhere, though it was stripped of the honeyed lies I had once adored. It was David. He wasn't crying or pleading for my safety. He was bartering. He was speaking to a man named Han, the head of a rival syndicate that had been trying to claw at the edges of Kenji's territory for years. I know the layout of the back entrance to the harbor estate, David's voice hissed, frantic and slippery. I can get you in. I can give you the girl. Kenji is distracted by her. He's soft for her. If you take Maya, he'll drop his guard. Just clear my markers. That's all I want. Give me my life back, and the bride is yours. The recording cut out with a digital click that sounded like the cocking of a gun. My heart didn't break this time. It turned to stone. And the man I had stood at the altar with, the man I had planned a future with, was currently selling my location to a butcher just to settle his gambling debts. The surprise he had shown at the wedding wasn't heartbreak. It was the realization that his human currency had been snatched by a bigger player. Kenji watched me, his dark eyes searching my face for a flicker of the girl who had cried at the cathedral. He contacted Han an hour ago, Kenji said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. He thinks he's being clever. He thinks he's saving you from the big bad wolf by throwing you to the hyenas. Is this the man you were going to give your life to, Maya? I looked up, my hands no longer shaking. He isn't trying to save me. He's trying to refund a purchase that didn't go through. Kenji leaned against the table, the serpent on his neck seemingly coiling in the morning light. He's arranged a meeting at a warehouse on the docks tonight. He told Han he would lure you there under the guise of a rescue. He's probably sending you a message right now, claiming he's found a way to get you away from me. As if on cue, the phone Kenji had returned to me vibrated on the table. A text message lit up the screen. Maya, I'm so sorry for everything. I have a car waiting for you at the north gate at midnight. I'm going to get you out of there. Trust me. I looked at the words, feeling a surge of cold, crystalline clarity. The naivety that had blinded me for 3 years evaporated, replaced by the hard logic of the stronghold. David didn't see me as a person, he saw me as a bargaining chip. And if I went to that gate, I wouldn't be going home. I would be handed over in a cage. "What are you going to do?" I asked, looking at Kenji. "The question," Kenji corrected, stepping closer until I could feel the heat radiating from his suit, "is what are we going to do? I could send my men to end him now. It would be easy. But I think it's time you saw exactly what your loyalty was worth to him. I want you to answer that message. Tell him you'll be there." "You're using me as bait?" I asked, my voice steady. "No," Kenji said, his fingers grazing my chin, forcing me to look into the crimson eyes of the serpent on his throat. "I'm using you as the judge. Tonight, David pays the price for being a coward. And you're going to watch the debt be settled in full." I realized then that the marriage contract wasn't just about money or spite. It was an initiation. As I typed back the word, "okay," I wasn't just agreeing to a meeting. I was agreeing to leave Maya Sterling behind and become the woman Kenji saw reflected in the dark ink of his skin. The warehouse at the docks had been a bloody theater of truth, leaving David a broken, exiled memory. But the morning that followed brought a different kind of coldness. I expected to be tucked away in the safety of the penthouse, a silent trophy of Kenji's victory. Instead, I found a tailored suit, charcoal silk, sharp-shouldered and commanding, laid out on my bed. There was no lace, no white, and certainly no vulnerability. When I walked into the dining hall, Kenji was already waiting, looking over a series of digital ledgers that flickered like lightning in the dim room. The serpent on his neck seemed to glow against the crisp white of his collar. "Today, you don't watch from the shadows," he said, not looking up, though his voice held that familiar, possessive weight. "The world thinks I married you to humiliate a debtor. They think you are a porcelain doll I bought to spite a coward. Today, we correct that misconception." We drove into the heart of the financial district, pulling up to a skyscraper of glass and obsidian that mirrored the one we had left. This wasn't a back-alley gambling den. It was the nervous system of the city's economy. As we stepped into the private elevator, Kenji handed me a tablet. On the screen was a complex web of shell companies, shipping manifests, and offshore accounts. "Han's syndicate isn't just attacking my borders with guns, Maya. They are trying to bleed my logistics companies dry," Kenji explained, his gaze fixed on the rising floor numbers. "They've found a loophole in the maritime insurance contracts. They're stalling my fleet in international waters, costing me $3 million every 12 hours. My board wants to respond with fire. I want to respond with a scalpel." The boardroom was a temple of mahogany and ego. 12 men sat around the table, their faces etched with the kind of cynicism that only comes from decades of operating in the gray. When Kenji walked in with me at his side, the air turned brittle. One man, an elder with a scarred temple named Mr. Cho, scoffed openly. "We are discussing a crisis that threatens our maritime dominance, Kenji," Cho said, his voice grating like gravel. "Is this the time to bring your new bride to the table? We need soldiers, not a distraction." Kenji didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply pulled out a chair for me at his right hand, the seat traditionally reserved for his most trusted advisor. "Maya has spent the last 3 years managing the accounts for David's firm," Kenji said, his eyes scanning the room with a lethality that silenced the whispers. "She knows how a thief thinks because she was nearly robbed by the best of them. Maya, tell them what you found in the manifests." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to choke me. But then I felt Kenji's hand rest briefly on the small of my back. A steady, grounding heat. I looked at the tablet, then at the men who viewed me as nothing more than a decorative accessory. I remembered the way David had dismissed my intelligence. the way he had kept me in the dark while he spent money that wasn't his. The insurance loophole isn't the problem, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. I swiped a graph onto the main projector. Han isn't trying to stall your ships. He's using the maritime delay to mask a short sell on your subsidiary's stock. He's not fighting for the cargo. He's fighting for the equity. If you respond with violence at the docks, the stock will plummet, and he'll buy the company for pennies on the dollar by sunset. The room went deathly quiet. Mr. Cho leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the data I had highlighted. He looked from the screen to me, then to Kenji. The dismissal in his gaze was replaced by a sharp, calculating respect. So, Cho muttered, the girl has teeth. She has a brain, Kenji corrected, his voice a low, proud purr, which is far more dangerous. For the next 2 hours, I didn't just sit there. I dismantled Han's financial strategy piece by piece, showing them exactly where to move the funds to trap the rival syndicate in their own short sell. I realized then that Kenji hadn't just saved me from David's betrayal, he was unearthing a version of me that had been buried under years of playing the part. As we walked back to the car, the city skyline reflecting in the polished glass of the lobby, I looked at the man beside me. The serpent on his throat didn't look like a warning anymore. It looked like a mark of recognition. You knew I could do that, I said, the adrenaline still humming in my veins. I knew you were wasting your mind on a man who only wanted you for your silence, Kenji replied, stopping as the driver opened the door. He turned to me, his dark eyes intense. In this world, beauty is a common currency. But intelligence? That is the only thing that buys true loyalty. You aren't my bride because of the debt, Maya. You're my bride because you're the only one who can help me keep the throne. In that moment, the weight of the silk suit felt better than any wedding dress ever could. I wasn't just surviving, I was becoming a partner in a war I was finally equipped to win. The midnight gala was held at the Grand Lyric, a venue that specialized in the kind of opulence that felt more like a threat than an invitation. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, rare orchids, and the sharp, metallic tang of hidden agendas. As the car slowed to a halt, the flashes of paparazzi cameras hit the tinted glass like a barrage of staccato gunfire. I looked down at my hands, resting against the skirt of a gown that was the color of a bruised sky, deep, midnight velvet that clung to my frame like a second skin. Kenji reached over, his fingers sliding beneath the heavy fall of my hair to rest against the nape of my neck. His thumb brushed the edge of my jaw, a grounding pressure that demanded my focus. They are going to look for the girl who cried at the altar, he said, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration. They are going to look for a victim to pity or a weak point to exploit. Do not give them either. Tonight, you are the steel lily. You are the only person in this room who knows exactly what I am capable of, and that makes you more dangerous than any man here. The door opened, and the roar of the crowd surged in. Kenji stepped out first, a shadow in a tuxedo, and offered me his hand. As I emerged, the whispers began instantly, a low hiss that moved through the crowd faster than the light from the cameras. I didn't look at the lenses. I didn't look at the socialites who pulled their pearls tighter as I passed. I kept my chin level and my eyes on the horizon of the ballroom, walking with the measured, predatory grace Kenji had been teaching me. Entering the ballroom was like stepping into a lion's den where everyone was wearing silk. The elite of the city, the politicians he bought, the developers he squeezed, and the rivals who wanted him dead, all turned as one. At the center of the room stood Han, the man who had tried to buy me from David. He was surrounded by a phalanx of guards, holding a crystal glass of scotch like a scepter. When his eyes met mine, a slow, greasy smirk spread across his face. "Kenji," Han called out, his voice cutting through the orchestral music. "I see you've brought the collateral. She looks much more expensive in velvet than she did in lace." I felt the temperature in the room drop. Kenji's posture didn't change, but the air around him seemed to hum with a lethal energy. Before he could respond, I took a half step forward, my hand remaining firmly on Kenji's arm. I looked Han directly in the eye, letting the coldness of the last few days settle into my expression. "It's a shame you couldn't afford the asking price, Mr. Han," I said, my voice clear and cutting through the sudden silence of the nearby guests. "But I suppose that's a recurring theme for you. I spent the morning looking at your short sale projections on the maritime stocks. It's quite an ambitious plan for a man whose liquidity is currently tied up in failing shell companies." The smirk on Han's face didn't just fade, it curdled. The men surrounding him shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the tablet I knew they assumed was just a fashion accessory in my clutch. I let a small, sharp smile touch my lips, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "If you're going to try to rob a dragon, you should at least make sure your own nest isn't on fire." A ripple of genuine shock went through the circle of onlookers. They had expected a trophy. They found a blade. Han's face flushed a deep, angry crimson, his knuckles whitening around his glass. He stepped toward me, but he didn't get far. Kenji shifted subtly, a wall of dark wool and silent menace. The serpent on his neck visible above his bow tie like a guardian of the gate. "My wife is observant, isn't she?" Kenji said, his tone deceptively conversational, though the threat was as sharp as a razor. "She has a way of seeing the things people try very hard to hide. I suggest you remember that before you speak to her again." For the rest of the evening, the power dynamic of the room shifted. People who had once looked at me with pity now approached with a wary, calculated respect. I was no longer the girl who had been abandoned. I was the woman who sat at the right hand of the serpent. I moved through the gala, navigating conversations about trade routes and political favors, as if I had been born to this dark throne. Late in the night, as we stood on a balcony overlooking the city, the cold wind whipping the velvet of my dress, Kenji stood behind me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel his presence like a shield. "You saw the way they looked at you," he murmured. "They're afraid of you now." "Is that what you wanted?" I asked, looking out at the glittering lights of a city that now felt like a map I was learning to redraw. "I wanted them to know that you aren't my weakness," Kenji replied, his hand finally coming to rest on my waist, pulling me back against him. "I wanted them to realize that I didn't just take a bride. I recruited a general." In the reflection of the glass door, I saw the two of us, the mafia king and his steel lily. The wedding dress was gone, the tears were dry, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the monsters. I was one of them. The aftermath of the gala left the stronghold draped in a heavy, contemplative silence. The adrenaline that had fueled my confrontation with Han had ebbed away, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. I found myself in the private medical wing of the estate, a place of sterile white and hushed whispers, where the smell of antiseptic fought the lingering scent of my expensive perfume. Kenji had sustained a shallow graze on his forearm during our exit, a parting gift from a desperate rival. And though he dismissed it as nothing, the sight of his blood on the white silk of his shirt had unhinged something inside me. I dismissed the nurse, taking the antiseptic and bandages into my own hands. Kenji sat on the edge of the examination table, his tuxedo shirt discarded, his torso a map of hard muscle and jagged history. As I worked, the light of the overhead lamp cast long, stark shadows across his skin, either revealing what the bespoke suits always managed to hide. It wasn't just the serpent on his neck. His back was a graveyard of scars, thin white lines from blades, circular marks from burns, and the thick, raised ridges of old bullet wounds. "You're staring, Maya," he said, his voice a low rasp that broke the clinical quiet. He didn't move away from my touch, though his muscles tensed as I cleaned the new wound on his arm. "I'm trying to count the lives you've lived before this one," I whispered, my fingers trembling slightly as I pressed a gauze pad to his skin. "They told me you were born into this, that you were the prince of the syndicate." Kenji let out a short, humorless laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. He turned his head, the crimson eyes of the serpent on his neck catching the light. The world likes to believe in bloodlines. It makes the horror easier to digest. They think I was handed a throne. The truth is, I was born in the dirt of a shipyard, the son of a man who owed more than he could breathe. I paused, my hand hovering over his arm. The powerful, untouchable boss of the underworld was suddenly gone, replaced by a man whose eyes held 1,000 years of salt and sorrow. My father wasn't a king, Kenji continued, his gaze fixed on a distant point on the wall. He was a dock worker with a gambling soul. When I was 12, he lost a bet he couldn't pay. The men he owed didn't take his money. They took his dignity. They made me watch as they took everything we owned. Then they marked him. They told him his debt would pass to me, that I would be their dog until the day I died. He reached up with his uninjured hand, his thumb tracing the jagged scar that ran across his ribs. I spent my teenage years collecting for the very men who destroyed my family. I learned early that in this world, people only respect what they fear losing. I became ruthless because I had to be. I collected debts with a ferocity that made even my masters tremble, because I knew that if I failed, I would go back to being the boy in the shipyard dirt. The serpent, I murmured, my eyes drifting back to the ink on his throat. You said it represents a debt that can never be fully paid. It's a reminder, he said, turning fully toward me, his dark eyes intense and unshielded. I eventually killed the men who owned me. I took their empire and burned their ledgers. But the debt I owe to the boy I used to be, that is the one I can never settle. I collect from people like David not because I need the money, but because I cannot stand the sight of a man who treats his life and his people as disposable. I saw myself in you at that altar, Maya, not as a victim, but as someone being traded by a coward who didn't understand your worth. The vulnerability in the room was a tangible thing, more dangerous than any gun. I realized then that Kenji's ruthlessness wasn't born of malice, but of a desperate, scorched earth survival. He didn't just want power, he wanted to ensure that no one could ever own him again. I finished bandaging his arm, my fingers lingering on his skin. The distance between us had vanished. He wasn't just my captor or my protector anymore. He was a mirror, but we were both survivors of men who thought they could use us as currency. You don't have to be the Imugi forever, Kenji, I said softly, my hand moving from his arm to his cheek, my thumb brushing the edge of the serpent tattoo. The legend says the trials end when the dragon finds the pearl. Kenji leaned into my touch, a long, shuddered breath escaping him. For a fleeting second, the armor of the mafia boss cracked, and I saw the man beneath, raw, scarred, and reaching for a light he had long ago given up on finding. I thought the pearl was a myth, he whispered, his hand coming up to cover mine, pressing it against his face. Until I saw you standing in that church, refusing to break. In the silence of the medical wing, the debt felt settled. We were no longer bound by a contract of spite, but by the shared weight of our scars. The rain over the city was a relentless gray curtain, turning the asphalt into a black mirror that reflected the neon ghosts of the high-rises. We were moving in a 3-car convoy, headed back from a late-night negotiation that had ended in a stalemate. Inside the reinforced cabin of the lead sedan, the air was silent, charged with the heavy stillness that always preceded a storm. Kenji sat beside me, his bandaged arm resting on his lap, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. He had been quiet since our moment in the medical wing, the vulnerability of the night before tucked back beneath a layer of impenetrable iron. The hit came with a precision that suggested a leak deep within our own walls. A heavy-duty transport truck roared out of a side alley. Its headlights blinded us for a fraction of a second before it slammed into the tail car of our convoy. The impact was a deafening roar of grinding metal and shattering glass. Before our driver could accelerate, a second vehicle swerved in front of us, blocking the road. "Get down!" Kenji barked, his hand slamming onto the back of my neck to shove me toward the floorboards just as the first spray of gunfire shredded the windshield. The world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of violence. The rhythmic thwack of high-caliber rounds hitting the armored plating sounded like hail on a tin roof. Kenji reached into the door panel, pulling out a sleek, matte black handgun. He didn't look afraid. He looked focused, his movements economical and lethal. He kicked the door open, using it as a shield as he began to return fire, his silhouette illuminated by the strobing muzzle flashes of the attackers. "Maya, look at me," he commanded, his voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. He reached back, grabbing my hand and pulling me up just enough to press a heavy, cold weight into my palm. It was his backup piece, a compact semi-automatic. "The driver is hit. They're closing in from the left. I need to clear the path, but someone is going to reach that door. Do not think. Do not hesitate. If the door opens and it isn't me, you pull the trigger until it stops clicking." He was gone before I could protest, diving into the rain and the smoke to draw the fire away from my side of the car. I crouched on the floor, the smell of cordite and gasoline filling my lungs. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, my fingers slick with cold sweat against the grip of the gun. Through the shattered remains of the window, I saw the shadows moving. Men in tactical gear, moving with the cold efficiency of professional killers. One shadow separated itself from the darkness, sprinting toward my door. I watched the handle turn. The lock groaned under the pressure of a crowbar, and then the door was wrenched open. The man who stood there was a nightmare in ballistic nylon, his face obscured by a mask, his rifle leveled at my chest. For a heartbeat, time became a viscous liquid. I saw the rain dripping off the barrel of his gun. I saw the movement of his finger toward the trigger. In that second, I didn't see a stranger. I saw the culmination of every man who had ever tried to take something from me. I saw David's betrayal, Han's greed, and the world that thought I was nothing but a bargaining chip. I didn't scream. I didn't pray. I simply did what the serpent had taught me. I raised the gun and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted up my arm, a sharp physical shock that grounded me in the reality of the kill. The first shot caught him in the chest, the second in the throat. He collapsed backward into the wet asphalt, the light leaving his eyes before he even hit the ground. The silence that followed was more jarring than the gunfire. I sat there, the gun still raised, my breath coming in ragged gasps that turned to mist in the cold air. The rain splashed against the man's cooling skin, mixing with the dark crimson pool spreading beneath him. A hand reached through the open door, and I nearly fired again until I saw the serpent. Kenji stood there, eye drenched in rain and blood that wasn't his eyes scanning the interior of the car before settling on me. He looked at the body on the ground, then at the smoking gun in my hand. He didn't offer me a platitude. He didn't tell me it was okay. He stepped into the car, took the gun from my frozen fingers and pulled me into his chest. His heart was steady, a rhythmic drum against my ear that pulled me back from the brink of hysteria. "You did what you had to do," he whispered, his hand cupping the back of my head, shielding my eyes from the carnage outside. "The debt is paid, Maya. You aren't a victim anymore. You're a survivor." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, I realized the truth of his words. The girl who had walked into that church in white lace was dead, buried under the rain and the steel of the docks. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with red, but for the first time, they weren't shaking. The blood on my hands had been washed away by the time we returned to the stronghold, but the phantom weight of the gun remained, a permanent phantom limb. Kenji had retreated into a state of tactical silence, his office becoming a war room where the air was thick with the ozone of high-end servers and the hushed, urgent reports of his lieutenants. They were looking for a leak in the security protocols, checking the physical movements of every guard and driver. They were looking for a ghost in the machine, but they were looking with the eyes of soldiers. I knew better. I knew that a man like David, weak, desperate, and small, didn't manage to embezzle millions from a man like Kenji without a silent partner holding the door open. I didn't ask for permission. I simply walked into the server room, the charcoal suit I wore feeling more like a second skin than a costume. The tech team looked at me with a mix of confusion and the newfound fear I had earned at the gala, but they stepped aside when I pulled up the encrypted ledgers Kenji had shown me before. While the soldiers looked for broken gates, I looked for broken numbers. I sat for hours, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes, tracing the digital breadcrumbs David had left behind. David was a gambler, but he wasn't a genius. The millions he had stolen hadn't just vanished into offshore accounts. They had been laundered through a series of consultancy fees paid to a domestic logistics firm. I dug deeper, peeling back the layers of shell companies until I hit a wall of high-level encryption, the kind only accessible with a syndicate-level key. My heart began to drum a steady rhythmic warning against my ribs. David hadn't found a loophole, he had been given a map. I cross-referenced the transaction timestamps with the internal security logs of the stronghold. Every time a major withdrawal was made, the same internal authorization code appeared. Delta 9. I stood up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor like a scream. I knew that code. It belonged to Mr. Cho, the elder board member who had scoffed at my presence in the meeting. The man who had sat at Kenji's left hand for a decade was the one who had funded David's lifestyle, using my ex-fiancé as a disposable front to drain Kenji's liquidity. The attack on the convoy hadn't been a random hit by Han. It had been a coordinated effort by Cho to ensure the investment and the investors died in the rain together. I found Kenji in the library, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city he ruled. The serpent on his neck looked dark, almost black, in the moonlight. When I approached him, I didn't speak. I simply handed him the tablet with the final audit displayed in stark, undeniable red. He studied the screen for a long, agonizing minute. I watched the muscle in his jaw tighten, the only outward sign of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Cho, he whispered, the name sounding like a curse. He was with my father on the docks. He was the one who taught me how to balance the books. He wasn't balancing them, Kenji, I said, my voice steady despite the cold dread pooling in my stomach. He was rewriting them. He used David to create a deficit he could exploit. He didn't want a seat at your table. He wanted the table itself. The hit tonight wasn't about the maritime stocks. It was about cleaning the slate. If we had died, Cho would have stepped in as the stabilizing force to take over the syndicate. Kenji turned to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine shock in his dark eyes. Not at the betrayal, but at the realization that the woman he had claimed as a debt had just saved his empire from a ghost. He reached out, his hand cupping my face, his thumb grazing the spot where a stray drop of rain had dried on my skin. I thought I was bringing you into my world to protect you, he murmured, his voice thick with a sudden fierce pride. But it seems you are the only one capable of seeing the knives before they strike. The revelation changed everything. The war wasn't at the borders anymore. It was inside the house. Cho was a founding member, a man with his own loyalists and his own private army. Moving against him would mean a civil war within the organization, a coup that could tear the stronghold apart. What happens now? I asked, looking into the crimson eyes of the serpent on his throat. Kenji's expression hardened, the vulnerability of the library vanishing into the lethal mask of the boss. Now, we stop playing by the rules of the board. Cho thinks he's playing a game of numbers. He doesn't realize that I've changed the currency. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. Prepare yourself, Maya. Tomorrow, we don't go to a meeting. We go to a funeral. As he walked away to call his most loyal captains, I looked at the hidden ledger on the screen. I had found the truth, but the truth had a price. We were no longer just a man and his contract bride. We were two ghosts fighting to keep the only home we had left, and the next strike wouldn't be in the rain. It would be in the heart of the throne room. The boardroom was no longer a temple of commerce. It was a cage. The air hung heavy with the smell of ozone and the unspoken scent of treason. Mr. Cho sat at the far end of the mahogany table, his hands folded with a serene, terrifying patience, flanked by 4 board members who refused to meet Kenji's eyes. Outside the reinforced glass doors, the stronghold was silent, a silence that meant the loyalist guards had been neutralized or bought. Kenji stood at the head of the table, his hand resting on the back of my chair, his presence a dark, concentrated storm. "The audit is complete, Kenji," Cho said, his voice as smooth as polished bone. "The board has reviewed the losses from the maritime stall and the security failures of the convoy. We have reached a consensus. Your leadership has become a liability. We are invoking the contingency clause." Kenji's grip on my chair tightened, the only sign of the lethal tension in his frame. "The contingency clause requires a total loss of liquidity. My accounts are stable." "They were," Cho replied, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. "Until 10 minutes ago. We've frozen your primary holdings under suspicion of federal investigation, an investigation I personally initiated. You are a king without a treasury, Kenji. And a king without gold cannot pay his soldiers." The men around the table began to stand, their intentions clear. They were moving for the kill, expecting Kenji to reach for the gun hidden beneath his jacket. They expected violence they could categorize and crush. They didn't expect me. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating the cold, sharp lines of my face. "You're right, Mr. Cho," I said, my voice cutting through the rising tension like a diamond through glass. "A king without gold is a target, but a traitor without a destination is just a corpse." Cho's smile faltered as I turned the screen toward him. "While you were busy freezing Kenji's primary accounts, you left your Delta 9 shell companies exposed. You thought your encryption was internal. Yet you forgot that your logistics firm uses the same maritime insurance servers I dismantled yesterday." I hit a single key, and a cascade of digital red flooded the screen. "I didn't just find your theft, I mirrored it. Every dollar you drained from Kenji's fleet has been redirected into a blind trust under my name. And as of 30 seconds ago, I've liquidated your personal holdings to cover the maritime losses you created." The room went deathly still. The board members who had been rising to their feet suddenly froze. Cho's face went from smug triumph to a ghostly ashen gray. He scrambled for his own tablet, his fingers trembling as he realized the truth. He wasn't just losing his move, he was being erased. "You can't do this," Cho stammered, his authority evaporating into the air. "That capital, that's the syndicate's backbone." "It's mine now," I said, leaning back and meeting his gaze with the same cold indifference I had learned from the serpent on Kenji's neck. "And since I am the primary stakeholder, I am revoking your security clearance, effective immediately." The doors to the boardroom hissed open. This time, it wasn't Cho's men who walked in. It was a squad of Kenji's elite shadows, led by the captain who had survived the convoy. They didn't look at the board. They looked at me, waiting for the command. I looked at Kenji, and for a fleeting second, the mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man who looked at me with a reverence that bordered on awe. He hadn't just recruited a general, he had found his match. Kenji stepped toward Cho, his shadow lengthening across the table. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. "Maya is the Iron Bride, Cho. You thought you were stealing from a man. You didn't realize you were being audited by a queen. Take them," I said, my voice low and final. As the traitors were led out in a silence that felt like a funeral procession, the weight of the empire shifted. I could feel it in the way the guards bowed as they passed me, in the way the remaining board members sat back down with their heads lowered. I wasn't just a guest in this house anymore. I was the floor, the walls, and the roof. Kenji walked over to me, his hand sliding into mine. His palm was warm, and his fingers closed around mine with a fierce, grounding strength. "You took everything from him," he whispered, a dark, proud smile playing on his lips, without firing a single bullet. "Bullets are for men who don't know how to count," I replied, me looking up at him. The serpent on his neck didn't look like a mark of death anymore. It looked like a crown we both wore. The coup was over. The assets were mine. But as I looked at the digital empire at my fingertips, I knew the real battle was just beginning. We had purged the house, but the world was still watching, waiting to see if the steel lily could truly rule the garden of thorns. The cathedral doors did not surrender this time. They were opened wide by guards who wore their suits like armor and their loyalty like a religion. The air was no longer thick with the scent of betrayal and the stale sweat of a coward's fear. Instead, the nave was filled with the fragrance of black calla lilies and expensive incense, a scent that commanded respect rather than pity. There were no 300 judgmental guests filming on their phones. The pews were occupied by the survivors of the coup, the captains who had bled for the throne and the board members who had learned that the woman at Kenji's side was the true architect of their survival. I stood at the threshold, draped not in the delicate, fragile lace of a victim, but in a gown of heavy ivory silk that shimmered like a sharpened blade. My veil was a gossamer shadow, and my hands, which had once shaken at the thought of David's touch, were steady as they held a bouquet of dark roses. I did not wait for a father to give me away, nor did I look for a protector to guide my steps. I walked down the aisle with my head held high, my bare feet silent on the marble that had once witnessed my greatest humiliation. At the altar, Kenji waited. He was a vision of dark elegance, his tuxedo blacker than the night we had survived. As I approached, the light from the stained glass windows caught the serpent on his neck, the crimson eyes of the ink glowing with a fierce, quiet pride. He didn't look like a man collecting a debt. He looked like a man who had finally found the pearl at the end of a 1,000-year trial. When I reached the steps, he reached out, his hand warm and certain as it closed around mine. There was no tremor in his grip, no damp fear, only the grounding heat of a partner. We turned to face the priest, the same man who had stood frozen in shock weeks ago. Today, the priest's voice did not crack. He spoke the traditional words with a weight that suggested he finally understood the gravity of the union he was witnessing. "Do you, Kenji? Take this woman?" "I do," Kenji interrupted, his voice a low, melodic resonance that filled the vaulted ceiling. He didn't wait for the prompt. He looked at me, his dark eyes unshielded, letting me see the man behind the mafia boss, the boy from the shipyards who had finally stopped fighting the world alone. "And do you, Maya, take this man?" I looked at him, and for a heartbeat, I remembered the girl who had chased after a coward in this very aisle. She was gone, buried under the rain of the convoy and the digital red of the audit. I was the Iron Bride, the Steel Lily, the woman who had liquidated empires to save the man standing before me. "I do," I said, my voice stronger than it had ever been, echoing through the stone pillars with a finality that sealed the past. There were no rings thrown in anger today. Kenji slid a band of platinum and black diamonds onto my finger, a circle of unbreakable strength. When he leaned in to kiss me, it wasn't a chaste brush of lips or a claim of ownership. It was a seal of a blood-bound pact. His lips were warm, tasting of wine and victory, and for a moment, the world outside, the wars, the debts, and the shadows, ceased to exist. As we turned to walk back down the aisle, the congregation rose as one, a silent, powerful wave of black suits and bowed heads. We passed the spot where David had once stood, and I didn't even glance at the floor. The ghosts were gone. Sunlight poured through the open doors, bright and blinding, and as we stepped out into the air, I didn't feel like I was being led into a gilded cage. I felt like I was stepping onto a battlefield, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the map. The black car was waiting, its engine humming like a tethered beast. Kenji helped me inside, his hand lingering on my waist before he followed, the door closing with that heavy, final thud. As the car began to move, I looked at the platinum band on my finger and then at the man beside me. The contract was over. The marriage had begun. "Where to now?" I asked, leaning my head against his shoulder. Kenji looked out at the city spread before us, the serpent on his neck pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. "Wherever you want, Maya," he whispered, his fingers interlacing with mine. "The city belongs to us now,